Hello, and welcome to another live event for subscribers to The Economist. I'm Andrew Palmer. I write our weekly Bartleby column on the workplace and host our new podcast, Boss Class, on how to become a better manager. And that's the topic of today's event. Something I've learned and Boris Johnson proved is that journalists don't always make the best managers. So I'm very pleased to welcome two expert guests to today's session. Amy Edmondson is a professor at Harvard Business School and the person who brought the idea of psychological safety to managers' attention. Her latest book is Right Kind of Wrong, about failing well. Claire Hughes-Johnson was the chief operating officer of Stripe as the digital payments firm grew from 160 employees to over 7,000. And she's the author of Scaling People, a practical reference guide for managers. So there's a thirst for guidance on how to manage better. Roughly a fifth of corporate employees in America are managers. Almost everyone has a manager. Half of Americans who've left a job say they did so because of a bad boss. And over 80% of managers in a survey in Britain said they had no proper management skills, full marks for candor at least. So I'd like to ask you both the same question to kick off. What do you think is the most common thing that a manager gets wrong? And Amy, perhaps I can turn to you first.
The most common thing that a manager gets wrong is to double down on performance demands in turbulent times, to declare failure off limits when there are challenges ahead. And I understand where it's coming from, I empathize, but it's wishful thinking, right? It's in those times where you actually must expect and assume that things will go wrong, and where experimentation and innovation is more important than ever.
So don't bend sort of reality to what you want it to be. Be accepting of how things actually are.
It's wishful thinking. It's magical thinking that if people just try hard, all will go well. That's not the world we live in.
Claire, what do you think?
I think the most common management issue is actually just giving honest and direct feedback.
Not doing it.
Not doing it, not knowing how to do it, not being comfortable doing it, not taking some risks when sometimes saying, hey, I have an observation or I have a question about something I saw you do. I think you can frame it in a way that it doesn't feel quite so scary, but I'm glad to hear humans are worried about judging each other. And we certainly don't want to cause someone to have a negative reaction. But my experience with managers, by the way, of all levels of experience, is they wait too long and they are not direct enough to provide feedback.
I see Amy nodding too. We might just stick on this for a little while because it does come up an awful lot. So what is your advice? You're a manager, you have an awkward conversation coming. How do you get over the hump? And maybe Claire, I'll go to you, and then Amy, if you'd like to follow up.
Yeah, I mean, I have this expression, which is say the thing you think you cannot say, which sounds scary, I realize, but actually it's really about there's something in your head and you need to figure out a way to translate it and get it out of your mind into your words that someone could hear. I had a friend recently who has a smaller family business and they'd hired a general manager. And then it got back to her that this person had made some disparaging remarks about the business to some others in the field. And she said to me, I'm going to see him tomorrow. What am I going to say? And I said, here's the thing. Why don't you say, it's gotten back to me that you've made some disparaging remarks about our company to some peers in the field. What do you think? Like, did you, ask, I'm just telling you the truth. You think you can't just tell them, but once you tell them, and actually if you phrase it as a question, if you say, is this true? Or if you did do that, I'd love to hear your version of that, right? And she was like, wow, I could just tell him that thing in my head that's bothering me. Like, well, I don't know, Amy, maybe you have some. Well, why is it that managers get blocked on just doing that?
Well, I think, you said it's we don't want to be seen as judging. We know we're judging. We're judging people all the time. And in fact, we don't mind judging people behind their back, right? We do. That's perfectly normal, natural, expected in organizations and out. So I think the reason we don't do it is it's deeply uncomfortable to give feedback. And the way to do it is essentially quickly and forward-looking, right? and quickly, concretely, and forward-looking. So quickly means don't let a problem, a worry, a concern fester. It just gets worse with age. And Forward looking means it's really about, I mean, the reason to do this is not to judge you, call you bad in the past. It's to look forward together and say, what do we need to do? What needs to happen going forward for better outcomes, for better results?
There's probably also in the boss's mind the worry that there's going to be a very bad reaction. And in practice, does that happen? Or is there actually a kind of an acceptance that there is a problem?
Not my experience is 9 times out of 10, there is not a bad reaction. I think maybe a few times out of 10, there's some confusion. Like maybe your delivery hasn't been as crisp, or to Amy's point, maybe you haven't been quite as concrete as you could have been. And so someone's saying, I'm not sure I understand what you're saying. And I worry that managers, the minute that someone does a little bit of pushback, they sort of back way off. But instead you should say, okay, let me try to come up with an example. In the meeting last week, I observed you to be a little bit nervous in your presentation. You know, did you experience that? I'm just talking about my observations, but like try to get it more concrete if they're confused. But 9 times out of 10, someone has been waiting for the feedback. They know. Deep inside them, they know, and they're waiting to have an opportunity. And I love, Amy, your point, which is, how can I help you? How can we work on this? How do we make that, if you're a nervous presenter, let's work on it so you're not in the future. Because I want you, as a manager, you want the person to succeed. And so I think being fearful of a bad reaction is a blocker, but I think it shouldn't be one that prevents you from giving the feedback. The only time, by the way, when I've gotten a bad reaction, I mean, not the only time, but my favorite thing to do in that moment is to give space, right? And to say, okay, I can tell this isn't a great time to talk about this. Maybe you need to process this. Maybe I need to send something in writing that gives you the example more concretely. Why don't we take a day or two? Why don't we come back and talk about this another time? You know, I mean, it's totally fair to stop the conversation, but don't give up. I mean, Amy's so right. This stuff festers, and actually any sign you see of something that could end up declining usually does decline. And so if you don't start to get on it, it's going to roll down the hill and be really bad behavior. And so I think there is this question, I know they do in like CBT training for people with anxiety, which is like, what's the worst thing that can happen? Right? And I think actually the worst thing that can happen is you have to stop the conversation and say, wow, we both need some space to think about this. I could do a better job framing this for you. Let me come back tomorrow. That is not such a bad thing. Yes, someone, I mean, it's never happened to me. I guess someone could come and flip the table and yell at you. But even that feels deeply uncomfortable, but you're putting something out on the table that you're thinking in your head about someone who you're evaluating their performance. And the best thing to do as a manager and say, the thing in my head, I'm telling you, because they would rather, deep down, they would rather know, how are you evaluating me? What do you think of my performance? And I think too often we sort of hold it back because we're afraid.
We wait too long, and then it's a surprise because there's an assumption that they have it all as well. And I do think when that happens, which it does happen often, it's really important to take accountability, to take responsibility for that, you know, to say, this is on me. And I apologize for not sharing some of my observations sooner, because I think they really will help you going forward.
Yeah. You just reminded me, Amy, one of the mistakes that I made that I talk about in my book is actually with a very high performer who I, had been giving recognition to and giving some feedback to, but she had developed the expectation, which is not wrong, that she was going to be promoted.
Right.
And we go through this promotion cycle, and I find myself having to explain to her why she was not. And I do think she was going to be eventually, but we ended up having a really important feedback conversation in this case about the fact that she often her team's work was often her doing the work as opposed to her developing the people under her.
Right.
And delegating more effectively and building a system of getting the work done versus her individual talent and heroics. And she had very rightly said to me, I don't feel like you've ever said that to me, like as a development area. And I said, I am sorry. I bet I have not clearly said that to you. And I have had that observation, and I haven't shared it because you've just been doing so well, but that's, again, another mistake I think managers make is not spending time with their top performers and giving them more to chew on that they need to work on. And I made that mistake.
Let's move to another thing that people really do talk about a lot, and that's meetings. This seems to be a topic that resonates with absolutely everyone because we've all been in terrible ones, and we all want to be in good ones. And Amy, I might come to you first. You're best known, as I think I said in the introduction, for your studies of psychological safety. And when we talked for the podcast, you described that as permission for candor. So how does one run a meeting as a manager so that everyone present feels like they can speak up?
Well, I think I want to first say, what does a good meeting look like? I think a good meeting is one in which if you're there, you're needed. And because you're needed, you are either contributing or listening and processing, right? You're not parallel processing, you're not doing something else. You're either speaking to the issue at hand or deeply listening to what other people are saying. Number two, it's heavy on inquiry, and that's going to be a partial answer to your first question. And number three, it's disciplined. It's efficient. Everyone has a sense of mutual learning. With each passing moment, I am getting smarter about the issue, and I believe you are as well. So there's a sense of moving forward in a good meeting. How do you bring that about? First of all, clarity about what the meeting is for. So therefore, who should be there, needs to be there, is clear. Second of all, it's no longer than it has to be, but it's as long as it needs to be to really deeply engage with the issue that depends on its importance and uncertainty. And finally, you're leading with inquiry. You are asking the kinds of thoughtful questions that lead people to dig deeper into their knowledge, into their understanding, into their predictions of how this might work or not work.
I would love to be in a meeting where I felt like I was getting smarter minute by minute. I feel like I'm getting older. So Claire, what do you think are the best things to do to run a meeting well?
Yeah, I mean, I think you actually started with my answer, which is someone needs to run the meeting. And I think all too often a meeting is called and a bunch of people show up and no one, to Amy's point, is driving. A meeting is a process. And to get through a process, someone has to lead through steps of a process. And so there has to be a meeting leader. And I recommend sometimes that you actually have multiple roles for a meeting. You have someone who's meant to be taking notes or note of decisions that are made, someone that's tracking, action items, someone that's facilitating. But let's just say you're the person and you've got to run the meeting. You got to start, as Amy said, with clarity, which is, why are we meeting? And I think one of the things that I observe happen the most often is you've got to state the obvious here. You've got to make it explicit. We are here to make a decision. We are here, right, in the case of the kind of meeting Amy's deciding, we are all going to accumulate some knowledge over the course of this hour. You also need a limit. How long are we meeting? Why are we meeting? And then here's how I propose. I'm the meeting leader. We're going to get through a process to get that done. Maybe it's just information sharing and we need to align, which is a form of a decision. Maybe it's a really thorny issue and I need you all as experts and I expect you all to participate. But too often we don't lead actively and we don't explain exactly what we want out of it. And extra points for gut checking and saying, are these the right people before you even start? Do we have the people we need to meet this objective? Hopefully you did your homework and they're there in the room, but if they're not, don't waste people's time with a meeting where you don't actually have the decision maker.
How do you give people permission not to be there? Because people will get paranoid about missing out.
I mean, I think, Amy, I think there's a way to inclusively run your teams, and that extends to your meetings. And so if you've created a culture, which I hope I do, of let's check in at the beginning of a session together and say, where are people at? What are your objectives for the time together? And by the way, if it's a meeting check-in, I say, given what you now know about what we're trying to do, are you the right person? Is this the best use of your time? But they have to feel comfortable saying, you know what, it's not, I'm going to pack up my laptop and walk out. I mean, the more that you can celebrate when people do that, just publicly, be like, yes thank you. But the better. But it is, if the team doesn't feel comfortable being open and honest with you as the leader and you're the meeting leader, they are going to sit there uncomfortably. But that is a bigger set of work you probably have to do.
I'm going to ask a couple of questions from subscribers, and Amy, I'll come to you. So one is David, who's asking, how can I effectively guide my own boss to stay on track and maintain focus during meetings? So the problem is the person in charge. What can you do?
Yeah, you can use inquiry on that one too, right? You can say, I mean, I love what Claire said, because first of all, I think it's really important, and your question acknowledges it as well, to note that meetings don't manage themselves. They have to be led. That doesn't mean they have to be led by the manager, but they must be led. So goal clarity, role clarity, process clarity is an ingredient of any well-led meeting. If you are a subordinate in a meeting that seems to lack those, lead with inquiry. Come right in and ask, is everyone else clear about what we're hoping to accomplish in this meeting? Because I have to admit I'm not. So it would really help me to know more. And what would be helpful for me? What role would be helpful for me to play in this meeting? I'm happy to be timekeeper or note keeper, or devil's advocate, or any role that might be needed. So, just expressing genuine interest and curiosity in making it better through some of those simple prods, I think can work.
Yeah, in the moment, I think absolutely using your own inquiry. Like if you're probably not the only one thinking this meeting is way off track, and just being able to say, "Hey, I thought our objective was X. Can I just check my understanding? Are we trying to get to X?" And hopefully, then your manager. But I'm with Amy, which is offer to play a role in the meeting, offer to facilitate or note take, and then as a note taker, you can say, "I just want to clarify. We're meant to be midway through the agenda. Are we tracking to that? Because I want to just make a note." I mean, don't be too sneaky, but I think you can
Yeah.
direct things from the side and as a participant. The other thing, obviously, I mean, is sometimes there's an opportunity, not in the moment, but in a one-on-one with that manager to say, I've observed, this is again, say the thing you think you cannot say, take a risk. To say, I've observed that we're not always meeting your objectives for some of these meetings. Like we're starting where you have a plan and we're not getting there. Is there any chance that I could help? Or could I offer
How can I
some
help?
example? Yeah. How can I, you want to, I mean, managers want their team members to sort of, as long as you come with a solution, which is I will help you, or I have an idea. If they're a good manager, they're going to be listening to that. I hope they are.
I just want to come back to, we have a little lag. So, the questions are coming in based on what we've been talking about a little earlier. And we're getting lots of subscribers in the live Q&A who are asking how to manage Gen Zers or Zers, I guess, for you two. So for whom candor is sometimes seen as harsh. So we talked a little bit about feedback and giving difficult feedback. Do you recognize that there's a generational problem? And if there is, how do you handle it? I'll go to Claire first, and then Amy, please come in.
Well, I have just somehow made a career of being a Gen Xer who's managing the millennials and the Gen Zs and the Gen Ys. So I feel like there are some generational challenges, but the fundamentals are still the fundamentals. The thing that I find with a group, and this can be an individual, it can be a particular generation that haven't gotten a lot of direct feedback, or they feel not as comfortable, or in particular very uncomfortable if it's in front of other people, which is you've got to set the norms in the environment of your team and whether that's a meeting, a team environment, and be very clear about your expectations of people, and then that you're going to hold them accountable. Because if you haven't done that and you catch someone out and surprise them with calling out something that they didn't get done, that is not going to go well. And actually, I'm not sure I care what generation they're from. Nobody likes that. So setting expectations, like we have a norm in our team of being quite direct. And by the way, about the work. Too often we think we're being direct, someone takes it personally, but actually I'm not making a judgment of you as an individual. This is not a comment about you and your character or your person. This is, we have a task to do as a team. We must get this work done. And to be a really excellent team, we all need to be able to comment on the work. And so one of my expectations is that we are going to have a high bar for the quality of that work. And we're going to feel comfortable in front of one another questioning it. Is this the best we can do? Was this the right outcome? Did this analysis serve our purpose? And you want to get the group practicing a little bit with some easier stuff before you go into the difficult version of that. But I think you set the tone. This generation actually starts to see the value of it and they welcome it. That would be my argument. But I do think you need to do more groundwork on norms and expectations than you might expect.
Amy?
I think that's spectacular. Honestly, I am very wary of solutions that say, oh, we're going to manage this generation this way, and then we're going to manage this generation that way. It just won't work. We need to manage everyone similarly. Some people have uh, more feedback opportunities than others. Some people may take longer to kind of get with the program. But I love that Claire said, it's about the work. That's what I say all the time. It's start with the work, end with the work. It's if there's an issue, there's a problem, it's red, you're not red. And it's all about our shared commitment to doing something hard, right? The work that we have set ourselves out to do to provide value for customers is not meant to be something we can do in our sleep, not meant to be something we can do without ingenuity and problem solving and trying hard. So keep bringing it back to that goal, that opportunity that we have, and what are we going to do? How does everyone need to show up to keep moving this boulder up the hill?
I want to just be led a little bit by the subscribers here. So there are a few questions coming in about remote work and Teams. So we've got one subscriber, Nancy, who's asking whether the two of you have any tips on managing a remote team. Another, Evgeny, is asking, are there specific tasks that are better suited for hybrid work versus ones that are less compatible? So both of you, with your kind of running Teams hat on, how would you respond to that, the era of remote work? Amy, I'm going to come to you first on this one, and then we'll go to Claire.
Well, let me start with the second question, which is, are some tasks or some projects or some work more suited to hybrid or remote work than others? Yes, yes, and yes, right? Absolutely. And I just think that is such an important thing to keep in mind. And of course, it's consistent with the emphasis that both Claire and I have expressed in terms of it's about the work. Let's take a look at the work that we have committed or set ourselves out to do. What will it require? Some work, some sort of problem-solving, innovation kinds of work that really require different disciplines, different perspectives to come together in a quite dynamic, organic way, need us to be together. Other kinds of work, writing a book, for example, we can do very, very well at a remote location. Filling out expense forms. There are many tasks that we do that do not have high interdependence with other people, that are essentially modular. Those can be done from a distance. And be very aware of the potential for erosion of our relationships, our commitment, our affection for each other if we spend no time physically together.
Claire?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I couldn't agree more with Amy's point about there are definitely types of work that are sort of better done in person. And I think my answer on tips for managing remote work is kind of where Amy was just going, which is I don't think you can not be together occasionally. I think you can approximate some things over virtual formats. You can use polling, you can use some tools that are in the market to get people interacting and engaged and get different perspectives the way you can. But look, before the pandemic, most of my career, once you get to a certain point, you're managing, if you're in a certain kind of company or organization, global teams or teams in multiple locations. So this is not a thing we've never seen before. But I think sometimes we forget that, which is like, actually, a lot of us are working in separate places. And the tool that I used then, and I'm coming back to now, is figuring out the cadence of when you're together. And for some teams, that might be once a quarter. That might be, I've heard of some companies where it's once a year. I think it really depends on the nature of the work of the team. And also, to Amy's point, if you're doing something very collaborative, high innovation, high problem solving, maybe high creativity, there may be a subset of your team that needs to go get together. You can imagine a product manager and a designer needing to be together with the engineer in person as they're ideating. So thinking as the manager or the leader, which is, what type of work are people doing and how often do they need to be together, or what kind of touch points? And if you cannot do that, if there's a budget constraint, which I know we're all facing today, you've got to figure out a way to pause the day-to-day, even in a virtual world, which is say, we're not going to have a regular work day today. You're not going to just get into Zoom and go Zoom, Zoom, Zoom. We are going to actually all have our cameras get whiteboard. I sometimes put a whiteboard, even though there's virtual whiteboards, I sometimes like have one behind me, like just feel like you're in a room and make it unlike your normal day. But I would prefer that you get together, because what I find myself saying to a lot of people is, if you pause as a team together and think at the strategic level, at the creative level, the planning of what are we trying to work on, you can then run very fast separately. But if you don't have those pause moments, ideally in person, it will erode to the point where people are just doing the tactical things they know they're supposed to do, as opposed to the really important work of sort of what are we going to become 6 months from now kind of work.
We've been talking a lot about teams here, and I want to just turn the attention a bit to the individuals that make up those teams, and the very specific question of hiring, which is one of the most important things that a manager can do. And often the outcomes can feel like a lottery. You don't quite know whether it's going to work until that person is on board. So how do you structure a process so that you have a high degree of confidence that you're going to get the right person? And Claire, let's go for you on that first.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're sort of talent is everything in your industry, in your business, which is increasingly the case, then your hiring process is kind of everything, right? So you really want to invest in it in the same way you invest in the product you're building, the business you're delivering for your customers. I cannot emphasize that enough. And I think this is where sort of companies, as they mature, especially start to outsource almost, whether that's an external firm or that the recruiting or the talent acquisition team is sort of on the margins of your business. And that I just can't emphasize enough that you've got to resist that. They've got to be your partner and understand the work so that they can partner with you on the following, which is really, really being thoughtful about what is the role we're trying to fill. What are the capabilities that we know make a person successful in that role? Because by the way, different humans are successful in different ways in different roles. What's the work to be done? And what capabilities are needed? Not like I can know how to make an Excel spreadsheet capability level, but we need someone with very high analytical skill, right? And then you got to figure out, well, how are we going to test for that in what is really an artificial process? Like 30 minutes, 45 minutes, maybe you give them a homework exercise. Think really hard and actually test your ability to test. The thing that I've discovered over my career, and I've interviewed thousands of people just because I happen to be at very high growth companies like Google and Stripe, is that your rubric of what are you testing for, and then actually really being consistent with how you use the approach. Even if you're a highly intelligent person and you're very empathetic and good at reading people, if you're not really testing the same things, say you're interviewing 10 people for the same role, it's very hard to compare those interviews. And so I've come to believe that there's just having a set of questions for each of these roles and really using them and then comparing across who's the best person for this role. And my final thing would be to say, I have a lot in my book about self-awareness. And as a leader, how important that is. It's not just about you and the individuals on your team, their skills, it's about your skills, is really understanding how to complement yourself, not in just who you're hiring, but actually who helps you interview. My worst mistakes are sort of hiring people who are so much like me that I just loved them in the interview. We're all a little egotistical. And I didn't have someone who was a really good counterpoint to me, drilling in on the stuff they cared about with a candidate to make sure they complimented me.
Amy, can I ask another hiring related question, which is, given the importance of psychological safety to the way that organizations and teams run, how can you test for that in a hiring process? And that's from both sides, right? Do you have a candidate who's willing to speak up? And if you're a candidate, can you tell whether the organization has a psychologically safe environment?
Okay, let me start with the first one. First of all, it's not, there's no perfect process that I have figured out. But what you're looking for to build, to join a learning organization, a learning team, to sort of participate in the mutual creation of psychological safety, you're looking for people with a growth mindset, with curiosity, who are not brittle, who are not absolutely allergic to the idea that they may be wrong sometimes, that they may fail sometimes, they may come up short sometimes. So you're looking for learners. You're trying to find these, Satya Nadella calls them the learn-it-alls, not the know-it-alls. You can sense out a know-it-all. but really only at the more sort of extreme cases of it. So you can get surprised, but you're looking, and I'll underline what Claire said about self-awareness. You're looking for people who are self-aware learners, who are much more committed to the fun of learning and growing and contributing together than to the need to be right or the need to be perfect.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to move on to some questions for the audience now, which are coming in thick and fast, but there's still time to put them into the Q&A. But before then, I want to do some shameless self-promotion and point you in the direction of a podcast I've made for The Economist. It's called Boss Class. And over the course of 7 episodes, I look at some of the practical issues that managers face and that we've been talking about today. There's a new episode every Monday. And in each episode, you'll hear more from Amy and Claire and a host of other people with hands-on experience of running things. Most of the Economist podcasts are now just for subscribers. So for everyone watching, that means you can listen to all of our podcasts as part of your current subscription. You'll need to link your Economist account to your chosen podcast platform, and the QR code on screen now will take you to a page explaining just how to do that. But now I'm going to turn back to some questions from our audience. We've got a really kind of simple but nice and important question from Kieran. What is a good boss? Do you have a definition? So Claire, let's go to you.
I think that, by the way, I'll just help plug Andrew's podcast. Andrew, you're so funny. I hope you'll make fun of me and Amy during this webinar, because I really recommend people tune in, because sometimes these topics are a little tough, but you make it light, which is hard. A good boss, I think for so long in my career, I made the mistake of thinking a good boss was, someone who really cared about you and supported you and coached you, and you really felt like they had your back. And yes, those things are wonderful and good, but actually you want to be on a winning team. A good boss is a boss that gets results, but how they get them matters. And that's where I really think management skills. I think a lot about leadership skills versus management skills. And I think depending on what kind of team you're on, what level your boss is, meaning are they a more senior executive or not, really over time, as they become more senior and your work, I imagine, is becoming more important with working with them, you want them to be a leader in that they have vision, they're setting the bar high, they're driving for a future that you don't even quite see yet, but they also need to be an excellent manager. How do they include people? How do they get all those ideas and all of your best talents out into the team, out on the table? And there will be times where your boss makes you uncomfortable and is your biggest supporter, but also sometimes your biggest critic. There was a sort of internal employee engagement survey question at Google that I used to sort of score pretty well as a manager, but one that I didn't score well on was my manager holds my work to a high bar. I didn't always score well on that. And I think it was because I was over-indexed toward the support system version of the job. And I really have, over time, I think, as I've accessed more of my leadership muscles. Now, by the way, that same exact question in the Stripe SAT, our engagement survey, is actually one of my higher, like, yes, all the time my manager holds, because I think I've focused on not just the how, but what are we getting done as a team? And it needs to be excellent. And you want to be part of that team.
Amy, I'm going to ask the same question, but in a slightly different way, because Pierre has come in with a kind of totally appropriate question, which is, do you think Elon Musk is a good boss? Because in the end, in spite of it all, he achieves great results. So what do you think?
Consistently? I'm not sure about that. I think we might challenge that in some of his undertakings. But I want to. I mean, I think it's just so. This is such an important question, not the Musk question per se, because I'll circle back to it. But I think a good boss is one who is absolutely creating the conditions for yours and others' learning, and candor, and openness, and honesty, and creating high standards, expectations. Which, by the way, is a compliment. If your boss is giving you high standards and assuming that you are capable of delivering to those high standards, it's a compliment. Remember that. So the best bosses are committed first and foremost to the shared purpose, to getting amazing things done with and through your help. And that means they must be not burning you out in the process of doing that. So that means they are as committed to your development as resources that will be helping build the future of the organization as to the short-term needs of the work and the project. So I think good management is, yes, about getting work done in a systematic and organized way, but it is also about getting people developed to be better versions of themselves, both interpersonally and technically. So how does Musk do on those criteria? I haven't read the whole book yet, but certainly many of the articles I've read and the excerpts of the book that I've read about Musk by Isaacson lead me to see him as falling somewhat short on some of these aspects.
Okay, well, if you're in the audience, Elon, write in, let us know what you think. But in the meantime, we've got another question which is about micromanagement. So in fact, we've got two. So Anne is wondering how mid-level managers can navigate top-level micromanagement, so people interfering from above. And then we've got Caleb asking if you have any insights on how to delegate tasks, so to resist the urge to micromanage. Claire, let's go to you first.
Yeah, I think the second question is easier than the first one. The first one, it is a challenge, right, when you're feeling micromanaged, and how do you manage up in a way that gives you a bit more of a shield? And I would recommend, I mean, there's so many things that we could talk for a while about this one, but I think one of them is to try to have what I call a meta conversation, right? So there's this tactical thing going on where your boss is like, well, did you get this done? And can you send me this in progress? And where are you on this assignment? And you're like, gosh, do they not trust me? Like, what's happening? See if you can get in a frame. Maybe it's the end of a one-on-one you have where you say, hey, may I just can we talk about sort of how we're working together or what you expect of me? And hopefully the managers, maybe they're like, well, what do you mean? You say, well, I'm feeling like you're checking on my work a lot. Is there something feedback you have for me? I mean, you can even say, I don't always feel like you trust me. Is there something I've done where I could, how could I show you that this work is getting done? Or how could I build a way of working that there's less of this checking and more of let's just see the work. And that maybe there's something you don't know. Maybe they haven't given you some feedback. I mean, when I become micromanaged, it is often because I'm concerned. It's because I'm not sure that the employee can get it done. And ideally, you're telling the employee that. So what I would say is go meta, try to open up the door to a conversation where you're saying, is there something I'm not hearing from you about how I'm getting the work done? Or how could I give you visibility in my work so there isn't this constant checking? But it's going to take a risk because you're going to have to open that door and they're not opening it. But I cannot recommend enough that you try to talk about the big picture with the person on how you're working together to see if you can improve the process. On the second one, on delegating, there's actually a lot of great cheat sheets on how to delegate well. And I reference some content in my book on this. But it's really, one, really think first as the manager, what kind of assignment are you delegating? And I think if you're smart about the framework, which is this critical and urgent, and who you're delegating to, I think to me depends on how urgent and critical the assignment is, and therefore your level of trust in the person you're delegating. You can sort of experiment. To Amy's point, you're trying to develop people. So I've learned over time to try to take some risks delegating certain things because it's something that might have a little more time to it, or it might be something that I think isn't as high stakes. But don't take that risk with something that is really critical when you're not sure if the person can deliver it. So really think about what you're delegating, but don't. Often managers hold too much. They think I'm the only one who can do it. And by the way, you're never going to grow yourself if you can't, you should have delegate all the work on your plate eventually. You want to put yourself out of a job, right? I know that feels scary, but you really want that mindset. But one, what are you delegating? Then outline the assignment. What is the scope of this? What do we think the timeline is? What do we think the work product looks like? So many people surprise me and they don't say what they think the final product is. Is it a presentation? Is it a memo? Is it an article, Andrew? What is it? And you're telling them, this is what I see. I just read an article where a manager said, I want the painting done, meaning paint the picture for me of what you're planning to do. Or the manager would say, let me paint the picture of you, what I think this looks like. And then have the person sort of play back to you. And hopefully you invite them to say, actually, I think it could be slightly different. Great. But do the painting, it's like the plan for the painting together, so that you're not surprised when you get halfway through and someone's like, well, I did this analysis and here's my spreadsheet. And you're like, wow, I thought I was getting a memo, right? But anyway, be very clear about the end product, clear about the timeline, the milestones for checking in, and what the standards for success are. I think too often we delegate without doing it's just like meetings. We don't run it well. We don't hit the marks on the process, and then we're disappointed because we didn't agree on the expectations.
Okay, that's very clear. We're down to just 3 minutes. So there's 2 questions left, and we're going to have to be very, very tight on the answer. So one is for you, Amy, which is how to balance maintaining hierarchy and psychological safety in healthcare. So when you've got senior clinicians who kind of need to demonstrate authority in critical situations, how do you balance that? And then Claire, for you, what's the ideal number of direct reports? And both of you, as quick as you can, given the constraints of that question. So Amy.
Very quickly, hierarchy is not the problem. It's how hierarchy is managed that really matters. And I've done a lot of research on healthcare where there are hierarchies everywhere and seen enormous differences across really identical clinical groups in terms of how those who have higher status in the medical hierarchy, how they handle that. In a nutshell, when they are curious, inclusive, when they say things like, I might miss something, I need to hear from you, that sets the stage for psychological safety, for continuous learning, for patient safety, and high quality care.
Super. Amazingly brief. Thank you. And Claire, this is from Jorge. Ideal number of direct reports.
I just want to plug Amy's work on this. Fewer people die in those situations, right, Amy? I mean, it's amazing research on how important. Yeah, when you think as a manager, your team has a high stakes job, look at the healthcare system and think about how important psychological safety is. Anyway, I think ideal number of direct reports is depends on the scope of the jobs of the people under you, but it's probably from 6 to 10. But I really, really think there's a lot of context needed to answer that question well. But I think too few is a mistake. I hate I formations because that's not it happens occasionally, but I would recommend you avoid it.